My name is Nicolas de Torrente. I'm the Executive Director of Doctors Without Borders in the United States, and I want to welcome everyone and thank everyone for supporting the efforts that we're undertaking and that others are undertaking to improve the situation of people affected by violence and displacement in Darfur and actually in other places around the world as well. Thank you. The crisis in Darfur has been going on for over 4 years now. And it's left a terrible legacy of human destruction, really. I mean, in 2003, 2004, in response to rebel groups fighting, launching military operations against the government in Khartoum, there was a massive campaign that was launched, a brutal repression to really, attack the social base of these rebellions and to drive people out of strategic areas, and that displaced well over 2 million people. Hundreds of thousands have been killed or died as a result. About several tens of thousands directly killed as a result of direct violence, but then in the process of fleeing their homes and finding themselves in camps. Several million people today are in camps in Darfur and in neighboring Chad, dying of disease and due to the poor conditions in these camps. So it's a real crisis, a real emergency, but it's one that's been going on for quite some time. And in response to it, there's a real important relief effort that's underway, and I think that's a key thing that's happening. I mean, the relief effort is very, very important. We have hundreds of aid organizations on the ground, UN agencies, humanitarian organizations that are deployed, about 14,000 aid workers, the majority of which are Sudanese, but also with international staff there as a whole. Doctors Without Borders, we have over 100 international staff and about 2,000 Sudanese staff. And this effort has been able to keep people alive, at least those who are in these camps, who are in these internally displaced people camps, where and it's been providing them with food, with water, with medical care, and purely in medical terms, if you look at it in terms of mortality rates, malnutrition rates, things are quite acceptable in these camps. Of course, from a human perspective, they're not. People are trapped. There's a lot of violence around, and they're really dependent on outside assistance. So there's a real problem of dignity, of not being able to cope and fend for yourself. You have to rely on outsiders helping you. But the aid effort is really significant and is really important. It's really meaningful. We're struggling, however. I think this is also a really important point. We're really struggling to reach people who are outside of these camps, especially in the last half year or so since the signing of this ill-fated Darfur peace agreement, middle of 2006. Violence has again intensified. There's been new fighting between the government and rebel groups who had not signed. There's been huge splintering among the rebel factions, and this has led to a really difficult situation for aid organizations. Very hard to know who we're talking to access areas. There's been a lot of attacks against aid workers that have taken place, partly by the rebels who are trying to loot equipment and cars and for their war effort, and partly because the government and its allied militias don't want aid organizations to be present in certain places, and that's really making we're really struggling to reach people who've been newly displaced, people who are in this gray area between the camps and the rebel zones, where we're also able to work. So the aid effort is a bit is strained, is threatened, and it needs support. It needs to be upheld, it needs to be defended, and that's the key priority we think that everyone should get behind, is to really support the aid efforts that are ongoing, because they're so vital for so many people in Darfur today. Well, I think the first thing before action is always awareness, and it's very important that people know what is happening. Darfur has actually gotten quite a lot of attention when you compare it to other crises in Africa. If you compare it to what's been happening in the Democratic Republic of Congo, for instance, where there's been a war that's been going on for many years with some efforts at political settlement, but really, I mean, if you look at what's happening in eastern DRC today, it's very, very dire conditions indeed, very little attention. Darfur actually, in contrast, has gotten a lot of attention, and I think what's striking for me is to see that it's continued, because usually after 4 years in a crisis like this, there is fatigue, people get discouraged, and so on, it fades into the background. But in fact, around Darfur, people have continued to remain engaged, and I think it's interesting to see that a night like this is happening today and not a few years ago. I mean, it's happening, people continue to be mobilized and affected and want to do something about what's happening in Darfur. Well, I think that it's important also for people to see how important it is to support the humanitarian relief effort for what it's worth, for what it is. It has limits. We're not able to solve the problem in Darfur, clearly, but we're able to provide really vital assistance, and to support that and to not link the humanitarian effort with broader political and military demands, solutions that are being called for. When people call for armed intervention, for instance, and say that that's necessary to protect civilians, to protect the aid workers, speaking out in our name in a way, and say that there needs to be an armed protection. It's actually of concern to us, because there are many instances in which armed intervention and troops going in, soldiers going into what will be and is a hostile environment where there will be opposition, will attract opposition and hostility against the aid organizations that will be associated to that effort. So that's of concern to us. There's a risk of the aid effort actually being affected, being hampered by if there is a military intervention, especially if it's opposed and resisted. And we know all too well that sometimes there are predictions that armies will walk in and things will go fine. But we've seen lots of cases where that's not been the case, and rosy predictions have been proven wrong. So that concerns us, and it also concerns us because it gives really an opening to the government in Sudan, who has been, has not been very open to humanitarian aid, to say it very euphemistically. I mean, in 2003, 2004, the government blocked off Darfur. We knew horrible things were happening. We're seeing refugees coming out in Chad. We knew something terrible was happening in Darfur. The government would not let us in. And so they don't want aid organizations to be present very much. And when aid organizations are seen as kind of, the vanguard or the tip of a spear that is in fact an armed intervention, which they view as an invasion of their country, that puts aid organizations very much at risk, and it puts us at risk. There's a real backlash against us, and we think that some of the security incidents that we've faced and other organizations have faced, and there have been a dozen aid workers killed in Darfur in the last 6 months, are due to this climate of hostility that has been whipped up by the government against aid organizations that they see somehow is connected to a broader plot against them. And that's another reason why we're quite concerned about this linkage of political measures and the humanitarian efforts. And we want the humanitarian efforts to be supported for what they are. And they need support. They need political support. They need, aid workers need to be protected and to be respected, civilians as well. And we think that's an important cause that needs to be carried forward and separate from the political and military efforts.